Last week, I went into school even though it was summer, and that was because my students were getting their GCSE and A-level results. Now, if you aren't in England or the UK, you might have no idea what that means. And so today we're going to be looking at the differences in testing between the US and the UK, but specifically focusing on England. So let's get started. Welcome back to Mrs. Wilson Science, and today's episode about the differences in teaching in the England versus the USA. I'm Janelle Wilson, and I have taught both in Florida, Georgia, and now in England. So I know a little bit about the differences in teaching in the different places. And today we're going to look at testing. Let's start with primary or elementary school. So elementary in the US, primary in England, and the type of testing that they do. Now, this is going to vary state to state in the US. However, there's usually some sort of state testing that's required at some point throughout elementary school. And it might not be every year, but at some point it happens. So when I taught in Georgia, we had something called the CRCT, the Criterion Reference Competency Tests. And these were given in both elementary and middle schools. And they tested a range of subjects from English or language arts, math or maths, science, and social studies. And they were given pretty much every year. However, they were kind of phased in initially in the lower elementary year grades. However, those were more recently replaced by something called the Georgia Milestones. And I'll be honest, I don't know a whole lot about the Georgia Milestones because they kind of really were up and running after I left and moved to England. But from what I understand, one of the main differences between the two types of tests is that the previous CRCT was completely multiple choice based. So every question was multiple choice based, whereas the Milestones assessments are now a mix of selected response, which is multiple choice, extended response, and constructed response. So constructed response would be kind of like short answer, and extended response would be a longer answer question, maybe closer to a short paragraph type answer response. Now, what are the CRCT results used for? Well, they're mainly used to kind of get an idea of how a school is doing and how students are doing. However, students aren't directly impacted by the milestone or CRCT, the state standard test. Now, in some areas, they might be used for promotion to determine whether or not the student is ready to go on to the next grade level, but generally they're taken too late in the school year, and the results come back too late for that to be used in that way. So generally, students are promoted into the next grade based on their day-to-day classes. And now this is a big difference from how students are graded as we get into secondary school in England. So now I'll explain that in a couple of minutes. What about in England? Well, primary school students in England have something called the SATs, not to be confused with the SAT. The SATs are taken in year 2 and in year 6. Year 2 is like first grade, year 6 is like 5th grade. So they're going to take the second year basically in primary school and then right before they leave. And those are used to see how students are doing, how they're progressing. And it's also used to set students in secondary school. It's primarily English and maths based, and the year 6 sets are taken obviously during year 6. So a lot of times in year 5 and year 6 are spent in preparation for these assessments. So a lot of students will get a lot of English and a lot of maths during those 2 years and not so much of the other subject areas, because these scores are considered so important in where the students will be set when they get to secondary school. Obviously, I'm in secondary school, and I know we use the data that comes from these assessments in order to give ideas for how to set our classes. And so when I say set classes, what I mean is we do have students ability grouped for some classes. In particular, maths is one that's very ability grouped. So science is too, but not as much. Not to such a great extent, especially in the first couple of years of secondary school, but definitely as we get further on into secondary school. As a teacher, like I said, when I taught in Georgia, we had the CRCT, and those results were a reflection on me as a teacher. And I taught high ability students, gifted, talented students, and accelerated students. And let me tell you, they knew that those tests were not going to have an impact on them. And so depending on where they ran on the spectrum, they might have tried really hard because they wanted to show off and show what they knew. And so they had really good scores on those. But had other students who were like, what's this? This doesn't matter. I don't have to try that hard. And so they wouldn't even really give it much of a go. And so I find that kind of evaluating teacher performance on an assessment that doesn't impact the students at all, so it didn't have any impact on anything to do with their grades, them going forward in the rest of their middle school years or into high school. Really challenging. And so that's one thing that I didn't like about standardized testing. We also gave a couple of other types of assessments. We gave the COGAT assessment, and we would do that several times throughout a student's elementary and middle school career. So that might be in 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 8th. And the COGAT assessment was a cognitive abilities test. That's what it stands for. And kind of similar to an IQ assessment. So it gave us some idea of how the student was doing compared to their peers. Norm reference tests, so how they are compared to everyone that's similar in their age and demographic. And we could use that to help us with placing high ability students into the Gifted and Talented program. Then we also had the ITBS, which stands for the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, and this would cover all subject areas, so science, social studies, English, and maths. And we would use this just to get an idea of how students were doing compared to their peers who took this test. And it gave us some, how they were learning, how our curriculum was doing compared to curriculum in other areas. I don't think they have anything similar to this in the UK. However, they do have a test in England called the 11 plus test. The 11 plus test is sat at the end of year 5 or the beginning of year 6, and it is used to gain entrance to selective independent and grammar schools in England. There are some similar tests in other parts of the UK that are used for this, and not all parts of England use the 11 plus test for getting into these schools. Basically, we have schools that are funded by the state, but they're for high ability students. That's what the grammar schools are. And in order to get in, students need to have a certain score on the 11 plus exam. If they do score well and they get a place in a grammar school, they then have the opportunity to go to that grammar school, or they could go to a secondary school in their area that's not a grammar school. Now let's talk about secondary testing. And so secondary school obviously encompasses both middle and high school in the US, but I already talked about the CRCT testing that we used to have in Georgia. Now, once again, those new milestone assessments are now in place, and they're taken less frequently. They're taken between 3rd and 8th grade every year for English and math, but they're only taken a few times for science and social studies. So it looks like 5th grade and 8th grade take science, and then 8th grade also takes social studies. Now, the milestone assessments also then feed into high school. And high school will have what used to be called EOCTs, end of course test. And like it sounds, they're taken at the end of a course. However, they're not taken at the end of every course. So in the US, remember that students will take a class for generally a year, and at the end of the class, they would take an EOCT if it was an EOCT class. Now, usually that EOCT assessment will account for 20% of the student's overall grade. The rest of the student's grade will come from what they've done in classroom assessments, classwork, homework. Now, the end of course test is not given for every course. It is currently given, these EOCTs, for the milestones assessments in 9th grade literature and composition, American literature and composition, then coordinate algebra, analytic geometry, physical science, biology, and then US history and economics. Any other class that is taken in high school does not have an EOC attached to it, and so it would be up to the individual district to determine how grades would be determined and if there was any type of major final exam at the end of the course. There's also often, from state to state, a graduation assessment that students have to take. And sometimes at the end of 8th grade, there's a writing assessment that students need to take to prove that they have writing skills. Where I taught, we also used to have something called the Gateway Assessment, where in 10th grade, they had to do a writing test that could cover social studies or science questions. And that was a graduation requirement. However, that was only in the district I worked. It was not a state graduation requirement. So let's look at what it's like in England, and it's completely different. It's a whole nother ballgame. So in England, we have GCSEs and then A-levels. GCSEs are taken at the end of year 11, and GCSEs stand for the General Certificate of Secondary Education. Now, I had to look that up. I've been teaching GCSE classes for 5 years, and I didn't know what it stood for. So these were previously called O-levels, but they changed in 1988. So they've been GCSEs for quite some time now. And students take these, like I said, at the end of year 11. And GCSE classes are taught for 2 or 3 years. It depends on the school how they do it. So my school likes to run a 3-year GCSE. Some schools will run a 2-year GCSE, and there's even some schools who run a 2.5-year GCSE. So basically, students will choose the courses that they want to take for their GCSEs at an earlier point. So at my school, my students choose in year 8 what they want to take at GCSEs. Some schools, they'll choose at the beginning of year 9, and they'll start halfway through year 9. In other schools, they will choose later in year 9, and then they'll start their GCSE work in year 10. The students are taught on all the content that's taught across those 2 or 3 year courses. Now, the content stays the same whether it's taught across 2 or 3 years. There's a lot of content, especially in my subject, science, and so it's almost impossible to teach in 2 years, at least effectively, and in order to get everything in. So that's why we choose it in 3 years. We have 3 exam boards who make the assessments up, and they are AQA, OCR, and everyone's favorite, Pearson at Excel. I'm kidding there, throwing that in because I know Pearson is like the bane of teachers everywhere. And these assessments will determine how they can continue into their education. So students have to stay in education until they are 18 years old, so they have compulsory education until 18. After year 11, they have 3 options. Option 1, they can continue and do A-levels, and this would be the most common path for students who plan to go to university. Option 2 is to go to a college. And a college in England is different from a college in the US. So in the US, when we say college, we mean university. In England, when they say college, they basically mean an upper level secondary school and similar to maybe the first year or 2 of a community college, where students often are learning technical skills to go into professions like carpentry, electrician, and things like that. The third option is an apprenticeship. In the apprenticeship, they would go directly to working at a site with a company, and they would be trained on the job and learn how to become something like maybe a mechanic or an engineer on an assembly line, foundational to the subject. Now, these exams are a mix of multiple choice questions. They might have matching questions. Most of them, though, are short answer and longer response questions. The papers also often will come in 2 levels, a foundation level and a higher level. The foundation level is for those students who have trouble accessing the higher level content. In the higher level content, generally there's more content, and like it sounds, it's at a higher level. The questions are easier on the foundation level assessments, and there tends to be more of the fill in the blank, multiple choice, and single word response questions. So what happens with these grades when the students get them? So they get these grades, and they determine whether or not they can move on to the next steps that they want to do. So they have to apply to the next 3 steps I mentioned that they had the option of A-levels, or college, or apprenticeship. They have to apply for those, and they generally have specific requirements to get in based on the grades that they get on their GCSEs. So last week, when my students got their GCSE grades, if they were planning to stay at our school, they turned around immediately and enrolled for 6th form, where they would do their A-levels. If they didn't get the grades they needed to stay to do A-levels with us, and we have specific entry requirements for different subjects depending on what they want to study, then they would have to go to maybe their second or third choice of place that they wanted to go. And we do encourage all of our students to apply to several different places for 6th form or college, have options open just in case they don't get the grades they're expecting. So it's really high stakes. If they don't get the grades they need, they can't study what they want, they can't go on to the steps they're expecting. It puts a lot of pressure on the students, which I find to be a little bit different from what it's like in the US. And they're having to remember things over 3 years, which is completely different from the US, where we basically only need people to remember things for 1 year. Finally, we have A-levels. And A-level exams are taken at the end of year 13, and the A-levels assessments are used to determine places at university. Different universities will require students to have either certain grades or certain number of points to get into the program of study they want to do. What students do when they are applying for university, which would happen in year 13, there are some applications that happen in October, so that would be Oxbridge, and if you haven't heard that before, that's Oxford and Cambridge. So if students are applying to Oxbridge schools or to medical school, they have to apply by October 15th. If they are applying to any other program of study, they do that at the end of January. And they do this through this general system called UCAS. We predict the grades that they're going to make on their A-level assessments, and they write a personal statement, and they get statements from each of their subject area teachers. And then that's used for the different universities to give them conditional offers based on how they do when they actually get their A-level results. I teach chemistry at A-level, and chemistry at A-level has 3 assessments at the end. I believe all 3 of the sciences are very similar. So we have 2 papers that are broken up by content area, and we have a 3rd paper that's a unifying concepts paper. Now, these exams that I've been talking about that students take, they're spread out over the course of, at GCSEs over the course of a month, and at A-levels a similar time frame. So they're not all at the same time. They are spread out a little bit, but students will often take a couple exams a day. So obviously there's a lot of pressure on students at A-levels to do well and get the grades that they need in order to go on to their next steps. This year and last year, because of COVID, obviously we haven't had assessments in the normal way we do. I always complain about high-stakes testing in the US, but high-stakes testing in England is completely different. It brings it to a whole nother level. And I think whenever I go back, when I go back and teach in the US again, I'm not going to complain so much about high-stakes testing because it's not the same. It's nowhere in the same ballpark. Let's take getting into university college for students in the US. They can take the ACT or the SAT for their entrance exam, as well as having all of their grades matter in how they in whether or not they get into their chosen colleges or universities. They can retake the ACT and SAT as many times as they want to until they can get the grades that they need for the program they want to enter. So there's not so much pressure to do well that first time, one shot. Whereas in England, if they don't do well on a test, if they don't get the grades they need, generally we don't let them retake things again. They can if they pay for it, and they're quite expensive to retake each assessment. Well, that was a lot of information. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about the differences between standardized testing in the US and England. I'm sure I left lots of things out, so if there's something that I didn't say that you think was important, feel free to drop it in the comments. If you teach in a different state and you want to say what it's like where you are, or hey, if you're in another country and you want to say a little bit about how testing is different where you are, please feel free to add that in the comments as well. And once again, if you haven't done so yet, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And if you like this video, make sure you give it a like. Until next time, so long.